when a veteran's service dog gets refused by airline staff, and I try to figure out how to handle the chaos that follows. Airports are a strange blend of chaos and routine. On this particular morning at Dallas Love Field, the steady shuffle of travelers painted a picture of normalcy. Among them was a man who commanded quiet respect. Without saying a word, his name was Terence Whitaker, a retired Marine with 22 years of service. The deep lines on his face told stories of courage, battles won and lost, and sacrifices most couldn't fathom. Walking beside him in perfect harmony was Duke, his service dog, a Labrador with a coat so golden it seemed to shimmer under the fluorescent lights. Terence had always been a man of preparation. His neatly packed duffel bag carried everything he needed, and Jake's harness bore all the certifications that allowed him to accompany Terence. Wherever he went, they were inseparable, bonded not just by duty, but by a mutual need for survival. For Terence, Jake wasn't just a dog, he was a lifeline, a source of calm in the storms that PTSD brought. As they approached the security checkpoint, Terence noticed a few admiring glances aimed at Duke. Children smiled, pointing at the well-behaved dog, and Terence gave a polite nod in return. Everything felt routine, just as it had been on countless flights before. But today routine would take a sharp turn. The gate to Flight 307 to Phoenix came into view, and Terence felt a pang of relief. He was flying to visit his sister, who had just recovered from surgery. Family meant everything to him, and this trip was a promise he couldn't break. With Duke trotting confidently by his side, Terence handed his boarding pass to the gate agent and waited for the usual pleasantries. But instead of the warm smile and a quick thank you for your service, the agent hesitated. Her eyes darted between Terence and Duke, her expression stiffening. "Sir, I'm sorry, but we can't allow the dog on this flight," she said, her voice low but firm. Terence frowned, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing inside. "Excuse me, Duke is a certified service dog. All his papers are in order." The agent hesitated again, her hand hovering over the computer mouse. "I understand, but there have been some complaints about dogs on flights. Recently, it's a liability issue." The words hung in the air, heavy and unjust. Around them, the terminal buzzed with the usual background noise, but for Terence everything seemed to sharpen. His eyes met the agent's, unyielding yet composed. "Ma'am, this isn't a pet. Duke is my service dog. He's trained to help me with my disability. I've flown with him dozens of times, including on this airline. I'm not sure I understand the problem." The agent glanced over her shoulder, as though searching for backup. Her hesitation betrayed uncertainty, but her tone didn't waver. "I'm sorry, sir. It's policy." Terence took a breath, steadying himself. He'd faced worse situations in his life, but this felt different. It wasn't just about him, it was about the principle. Yet as he prepared to argue his case, the people around them began to notice the exchange. A woman nearby whispered to her husband. A young man with headphones pulled one earbud out. His curiosity piqued, but this was just the beginning of a confrontation that would challenge more than just airline policies. It would question the very fabric of what's fair. Terence stood his ground, his voice steady and measured. "Policy or not, this is discrimination. Duke is trained for situations like this. He's not just my dog, he's a part of my medical care." The gate agent hesitated, her gaze faltering under the weight of his words. For a moment it seemed like reason might prevail, but just as quickly her resolve returned. "I understand your frustration, sir, but there's nothing I can do. If you'd like, I can call my supervisor." By now the small crowd of onlookers had grown. People leaned on nearby chairs, craning their necks to catch snippets of the conversation. A teenager with a skateboard under his arm muttered, "Man, that's not right," loud enough for Terence to hear. The murmurs spread like ripples in a pond, but Terence's focus remained fixed on the agent. "I'd appreciate that," he replied, his tone firm but respectful. "Let's get your supervisor here." As the agent stepped away, Terence crouched down, resting a hand on Jake's head. The dog looked up at him, sensing the tension in the air, but remaining calm. "Good boy," Terence whispered. Jake wagged his tail slightly, offering the only reassurance he could. Minutes passed and the whispers grew louder. A middle-aged woman with a carry-on bag approached. "Cautiously, excuse me, she said, her voice hesitant. I couldn't help but overhear. Are they really saying you can't bring your dog on the flight? Terence straightened up, nodding. That's what they're saying. But Duke's a service dog, fully certified. This isn't the first flight we've been on together. The woman frowned, her brows knitting together in disbelief. That's ridiculous. My brother has a service dog, and I've seen how important they are. I don't think they can legally stop you. Terence appreciated her support, but he knew the reality. Even when the law was on your side, enforcement was another story. Thank you, he said simply. We'll see what the supervisor says. But as the minutes ticked by, more people began to chime in. A businessman in a suit glanced up from his laptop. I'm pretty sure the ADA protects service animals, he said, loud enough to be heard by the surrounding group. A young mother holding a toddler nodded in agreement. It's wrong to treat someone who served our country like this, she added. The tide was shifting, but it wasn't fast enough for Terence. He couldn't help but notice the stares of others who kept their distance, their expressions unreadable. Were they judging him? Were they afraid to get involved? The uncertainty gnawed at him, but he stayed composed. Finally, the supervisor arrived, a man in his late 40s, with a sharp suit and a clipboard in hand. His name tag read Mr. Sullivan. He approached with the air of someone used to diffusing tense situations, but the weight of the crowd's attention seemed to unsettle him. Mr. Whitaker, he began, addressing Terence with a strained smile. I understand there's been a misunderstanding. Let's see if we can resolve this. Terence met his gaze unflinching. There's no misunderstanding. Duke is my service dog and he's allowed to be with me. I have his paperwork right here. He reached into his bag and pulled out the neatly folded documents. Holding them out, Sullivan skimmed the papers, his expression unreadable. But instead of a resolution, his words only deepened the conflict. The documents are in order, but we've had some recent complaints from other passengers about animals on flights. We have to take everyone's comfort into consideration. The crowd's murmurs turned into audible gasps and protests. That's outrageous, someone shouted. Another voice chimed in. He's a veteran, for God's sake. But instead of backing down, Terence knew this was the moment to stand firm, not just for himself, but for others who might face the same injustice. Terence felt the weight of the moment, not just for himself, but for the principles he stood for. He could feel the growing energy of the crowd around him, a mixture of anger and disbelief. The Marine in him, the man who had led troops through chaos, knew this wasn't just about getting on the plane anymore. It was about something much bigger. I understand you have policies, Mr. Sullivan, Terence began, his voice steady, but with an edge that commanded attention. But those policies can't override the law. I've served this country, and Duke is part of how I live my life now. Denying us entry isn't just an inconvenience, it's a violation of my rights. A ripple of agreement swept through the crowd. The businessman who had spoken earlier stepped closer, his voice now louder. He's absolutely right. You're walking on thin ice here, Sullivan. The ADA protects service animals. This airline could be looking at a lawsuit. Sullivan's face tightened. So I understand your concerns, but these situations are never simple. Let me consult with the team. Before he could turn away, a younger man in a hoodie raised his voice. This isn't complicated. You're treating him like he's invisible. That's not okay. The crowd, now emboldened, began voicing their support louder. The young mother from earlier stood with her toddler, balanced on her hip. If this is how you treat someone who served this country, what does that say about the rest of us? Do better. Terence was humbled by the voices surrounding him, but his focus remained on Sullivan. I'm not asking for special treatment, he said, his tone firm but calm. I'm asking for what's fair. Duke isn't a luxury, he's a necessity. Sullivan seemed to shrink under the weight of the crowd's disapproval. He glanced around, clearly overwhelmed by the attention. But before he could speak, another figure emerged, a tall man in his 60s, with a graying beard and a walking cane. He wore a hat embroidered with Vietnam veteran. His voice cut through the commotion. Terence Whitaker, isn't it? The man asked, stepping forward. Terence nodded, surprised. I know who you are. You saved my nephew's life in Kandahar. He wrote to me about you." The crowd fell silent for a moment, the gravity of the statement sinking in. The older man turned to Sullivan. "This man has done more for this country than any of us standing here, myself included, and you're telling him he can't bring his service dog on a flight. Do the right thing." The room seemed to hold its breath as Sullivan looked at the veteran, then at Terence. His hesitation was palpable, but the murmurs of the crowd were growing into a roar. Someone pulled out their phone, recording the exchange. Terence felt Duke nudge his leg, grounding him. The dog's calm presence reminded him of why he was standing firm. This wasn't just about getting on the plane, it was about dignity and respect. But just when it seemed like Sullivan might relent, the situation took an unexpected turn that no one could have predicted. Before Sullivan could respond, a stern voice crackled through the terminal's public address system. "Attention passengers, due to unforeseen circumstances, Flight 307 to Phoenix will be delayed. Please remain at the gate for further updates." The announcement shifted the mood. Groans of frustration rippled through the crowd, but the delay only seemed to strengthen their resolve. Now more passengers had time to engage, and the group around Terence grew larger. Phones were up, recording every moment. It wasn't just a gate confrontation anymore. It was becoming a spectacle. Then a woman in a sleek airline uniform emerged from a side door. Her badge read Regional Manager, and the authority in her stride was unmistakable. Her sharp eyes took in the scene, from Sullivan's tight posture to the phones aimed at him and Terence. She wasted no time. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice cutting through the noise. Sullivan stepped forward, his tone defensive. "There's a conflict about a service animal boarding the flight, ma'am. I was handling it." The woman raised a hand, silencing him clearly. "You weren't." She turned to Terence, her expression softening as she addressed him directly. "Sir, I'm Angela Cruz, the regional manager. May I ask what's happening from your perspective?" Terence explained calmly, detailing the situation. From the moment he arrived at the gate, he held nothing back: his history with Duke, the certified paperwork, and the repeated flights they had taken together. His voice carried no malice, only the quiet confidence of a man who had lived through far greater storms. Angela listened intently, nodding as he spoke. When he finished, she took a deep breath and turned back to Sullivan. "Why wasn't I informed about this immediately?" Sullivan stammered. "I was trying to de-escalate." "You escalated," Angela interrupted, her tone sharp. "This man is a veteran with a certified service dog. There's no ambiguity here. You're aware of the ADA guidelines, correct?" Sullivan nodded reluctantly. Angela then turned to Terence, her demeanor shifting back to professional warmth. "Mr. Whitaker, I deeply apologize for the inconvenience and the treatment you've experienced today. I assure you this is not reflective of our values." The crowd murmured approvingly, but Terence wasn't ready to let the matter drop entirely. "Thank you, Miss Cruz. I appreciate your apology, but this isn't just about me. Situations like this happen to veterans, people with disabilities, and anyone who doesn't fit the mold of what's considered comfortable for others. It needs to stop." Angela nodded, her expression solemn. "You're absolutely right, and I'll personally ensure that we address this incident at the highest level. Please allow me to escort you and Duke onto the flight." The crowd broke into applause, a few voices shouting words of encouragement. Terence looked around, nodding in gratitude to those who had stood by him. But before he could move, the older veteran with the cane stepped forward again. "This isn't over yet," he said, his voice low but resolute. "This needs to go public. People need to see what's happening." Terence hesitated. He wasn't one for the spotlight, but the weight of the moment was undeniable. The crowd support had already turned this into something bigger than a single confrontation. But as Angela led Terence toward the boarding area, the question lingered: would this moment spark the change everyone was hoping for? As Terence and Duke were escorted onto the plane by Angela, the energy in the terminal hadn't faded. The crowd lingered, talking amongst themselves, exchanging stories of their own experiences with discrimination, or sharing what they had just witnessed on social media. By the time Terence settled into his seat, the story was already spreading like wildfire online. Angela crouched down beside Terence in the aisle, her professionalism softening into something more personal. Mr. Whittaker, I truly am sorry for what happened. This shouldn't have escalated the way it did. Terence gave her a nod of appreciation. It's not about the apology, he said quietly, it's about making sure this doesn't happen to someone else. What if this had been someone without the confidence to push back, or someone without a crowd to back them up? Angela looked genuinely reflective, her gaze flickering to Duke, who sat calmly at Terence's feet. You're right, and I promise I'll make sure this is addressed internally. But the public response? She glanced toward the windows, where phones were still aimed at the plane. That's out of my hands now. Terence didn't reply immediately. He gazed out the window, thinking of the moments before this flight. How easily this could have gone unnoticed. Another quiet indignity swept under the rug. But this time something was different. Strangers had stepped forward. Voices had been raised as the plane began to taxi. A flight attendant approached with a tray of water bottles. She knelt slightly, her voice soft. So I just wanted to say thank you for your service and for standing up out there. My father's a Marine too. What you did matters. Terence nodded again, offering her a faint but genuine smile. Thank you, he said simply. The flight itself passed uneventfully, but Terence could feel the tension in the air, not from him or Duke, but from the passengers who had witnessed everything. The energy of what had happened at the gate lingered. He caught snippets of conversations around him. It's going viral, someone whispered, already trending on Twitter. Another said by the time the plane landed in Phoenix. Terence's phone buzzed with notifications. Family, friends, even people he hadn't spoken to in years, had sent him links, texts, and emails. The incident was already being reported by local news outlets. Hashtags like #HatSupportTerence and #VeteransRights were trending. As he stepped off the plane, Angela was waiting near the gate. Mr. Whittaker, I think you should know that the airline's PR team is already working on a public statement. This story has gotten bigger than we anticipated. Terence raised an eyebrow. Bigger than I anticipated. To Angela hesitated before speaking again. If you're willing, I think it might be worth speaking to the press yourself. You have a voice people want to hear right now, and it could make a difference. Terence didn't answer right away. He looked down at Duke, who was calmly scanning the terminal, as if nothing unusual had happened. I'll think about it, he said finally. But as he walked toward the baggage claim, he couldn't ignore the feeling that this moment wasn't just about him anymore. It was a spark that could ignite something much larger. By the time Terence reached baggage claim, the story had already grown legs of its own. Cameras flashed as reporters waited outside the terminal, their voices a mix of curiosity and urgency. Mr. Whittaker, can we get a statement? What are your thoughts on the airline's actions? What do you hope comes from this? Terence hesitated. He'd spent his life serving quietly, never seeking attention or accolades. But as he looked at the small crowd, he realized this wasn't about ego or recognition. It was about accountability. He exchanged a glance with Angela, who had followed him to the exit. She gave him a small nod of encouragement. Terence stepped forward, Duke by his side, and raised a hand to quiet the questions. I'll say this, he began, his voice steady but carrying the weight of the moment. What happened today wasn't just about me. It's about every veteran, every person with a disability, and everyone who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong. Duke isn't just a dog, he's my partner. My lifeline. Denying him is denying me. Reporters scribbled notes and held their microphones closer. I'm not here to bash anyone, Terence continued, but I hope this moment reminds people to think twice before making decisions that can hurt others. We all have a responsibility to be better for each other. The cameras captured his every word, and by the time Terence and Duke walked toward the parking lot, applause broke out from the gathered crowd. It wasn't loud, but it was heartfelt. Strangers approached, some shaking his hand, others simply thanking him. One woman in a wheelchair said softly, "You spoke for people like me today." Thank you. Angela caught up to him as he loaded his bag into a waiting car. That was incredible, she said. If you ever want to follow up with the airline or take this further, let me know. I'll make sure you have my direct number." Terence gave her a faint smile. "Thanks, Angela. I appreciate everything you've done today, but I think it's in the people's hands now." As the car pulled away, Terence leaned back, resting a hand on Duke's head. His phone buzzed again, a message from his sister. "Just saw you on TV, proud of you." Big brother. Terence let out a long breath. He'd gone to the airport that morning for a quiet trip, but life had a way of throwing curveballs. Yet despite the chaos, something about this felt right. His story, their story, was out there now. But what came next would prove just how much one moment, one voice, could ripple across the nation. The following morning, Terence woke to a phone that wouldn't stop buzzing. Calls, texts, emails. His story had gone far beyond the terminal in Dallas. Major news outlets had picked it up. Headlines like "Marine Veteran" and "Service Dog Denied Boarding Sparks National Debate," and hashtags like "Veterans Deserve Better" flooded social media. Terence scrolled through his messages, seeing names he hadn't thought of in years. Fellow Marines, childhood friends, even his old commanding officer. One message stood out, a direct message from a journalist at a major network. They wanted to interview him during prime time. His first instinct was to decline. He didn't enjoy being in the spotlight. But then he thought of Duke calmly lying at his feet, and the countless others who relied on service animals, or who faced quiet discrimination every day. If sharing his experience could help even one person, it was worth it. Later that evening, Terence found himself sitting in front of a camera. Duke at his side. The interviewer, a polished anchor with a calm demeanor, asked him to recount the events at the airport. Terence spoke plainly, his words not rehearsed, but heartfelt. He described his life with Duke, the struggles of living with PTSD, and the importance of empathy and understanding. "What do you hope will come from this?" the interviewer asked. Terence paused, looking down at Duke for a moment before answering. "I hope this makes people think about how they treat others, about how we can all do better. Policies are important, but compassion is what makes the difference." We can't forget that the broadcast went viral, resonating with millions. The airline issued a formal apology and pledged to retrain its staff on ADA compliance. Advocacy groups reached out to Terence, asking if he would speak at their events. He wasn't sure about all of it, but he agreed to a few, knowing his story could push for change. In the weeks that followed, the story faded from the headlines, but the impact lingered. Airlines across the country began revising their service animal policies. Advocacy groups saw an uptick in support, and Terence received letters from people he'd never met, some thanking him, others sharing their own stories. One letter stood out. It was from a young Marine who had just returned from deployment and struggled to adjust to civilian life. "Seeing you and Duke gave me hope." It read, "Maybe I can get through this too." Terence folded the letter carefully and placed it in a box with his other keepsakes. He looked at Duke, who was sprawled out on the living room floor, and gave him a small smile. "We did okay, buddy," he said quietly. "Sometimes it only takes one moment, one voice to make a difference. And when people stand together, even against the odds, change becomes possible." Terence's story isn't just his own. It's a reminder that standing up for what's right, no matter how small the moment may seem, can lead to ripples of change. Whether it's speaking up for someone, offering a helping hand, or simply choosing compassion over convenience, each of us has the power to make a difference. The real truth behind our story is yet to be revealed. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. The next part will be even more surprising. Until then, take care and stay connected with us.